Shabbat Shalom. So some of you don't know the story of how our guest speaker and his daughters, Sophie and Louise, got here from Newark to LaGuardia, from United to American, with cancellations and delays along the way. And it leads me to begin my introduction of him, which I'm honored to be asked to do. Rabbi Greenstein was gracious in inviting me. I begin the introduction by saying, never again will we take lightly the cliche, time flies. The last 3 times that I shared a bima with Edward Felsenthal were his bar mitzvah, his confirmation, and his graduation. But since that time, and this will be the last of these attempts, time marches on. But what tonight is about is in part how Edward has marched on in career, in contribution, in impact, and at the same time, who he is, that he was at that bar mitzvah, that confirmation, and that graduation. After graduating from Princeton and then a law degree at Harvard and a master's at the combined Fletcher School of Harvard and Tufts, Edward made a great impact with the Wall Street Journal, that icon of the media, because he was a leader in developing the personal journal, which was the part of the Wall Street Journal that was of great interest to those of us whose portfolios may not have required 8 digits. And that led to his being called by Tina Brown to be part of the founding of the Daily Beast. And it marked a step in what Edward has become, because he has been a leader and an innovator in the transition from only print journalism to print and digital journalism. He's been a leader, he's been an innovator. At a time when he came to Time, he was the chief architect of Time's digital presence. So many of us my age, and there aren't very many of us left, hard to say Time without saying Time magazine. But of course, America gets its news in many ways. And as I wrote this yesterday, my computer screen popped up with a story about Joe Biden, and it was from Time, the digital Time. So it's apparent that his being named editor-in-chief and CEO of Time speaks volumes about Edward's bridging the gap between print journalism and the various new forms that exist. So thank you, Edward, for the fact that we don't have to wait for the mail always to get the story. Because if I had to wait for the mail and the story about Joe Biden, Beto might have been too old to run. But Edward Felsenthal is not about titles and not even about awards or chairmanships and directorships. Most remarkable of all may be that in an age of self-promotion and pervasive hype, Edward remains the same person he was years ago as many of us knew him in his growing up. He's a person of superior intellect, but he never acts like he's the smartest person in the room, even though he might be. He is a person who is at home and welcome in world capitals and in centers of global impact. And Jeannie and I are aware sometimes when Gloria and Eddie happily go to spend time with the children while Edward is off to a World Financial Conference or a World Summit. He is at home, too, as the modest, unassuming Edward of his youth here. He has reached the pinnacle of his profession and remained the person he always was, the person about whom it doesn't always have to be. It is not about him. He's passionate about great issues, and those of us who read his editorial after the Tree of Life murders in Pittsburgh saw the combination of competent, capable, passionate journalist and one who opened himself and his background and his feelings to millions of readers. And finally, as a major person of influence in a time of great anxiety in his profession, a time when powerful voices condemn or even vilify the press and sometimes call for or indicate violence against its practitioners. Time's selection for Person of the Year of vulnerable journalists and newspapers speaks volumes about Edward's commitment to the importance of press and its protection. It was a call for renewed public support and respect for the profession to which he brings such honor, intellect, and innovation. So, on behalf of all of us, I'm happy to welcome back to Temple Israel someone who, besides the tributes I've shared, is the absolute rebuttal of another person who functioned in New York, Lippy Leo DeRocher, for those of you who remember him, manager of the Dodgers, who said famously, "Nice guys finish last." Now, we welcome a nice guy who finishes first.
Thank you, Rabbi Danziger, for those words, and Rabbi Greenstein, wherever you are, for inviting me. What a happy occasion, as my father would say. I'm delighted to be back, first of all, because Memphis and Temple Israel will always be home to me, but also because the day of travel that Rabbi D described was even crazier than it sounded. We had two sets of pilots and crews. We were back and forth between 3 terminals at LaGuardia, and we came in. I had planned to print out my notes, and I had to reach out to Micah earlier in the day, and I said, I don't think I'm going to have time to get home and print my notes, and so Micah printed them for me with the title sheet, Shabbat Classified. My bar mitzvah, which Rabbi Danziger officiated, is actually exactly 40 years ago tonight. Fake news. 40 years ago this year, 1979, and I was thinking, because I vividly remember sitting in one of those big chairs, worrying that my feet did not reach the floor, and I had a great sense of relief tonight that I didn't have to see if they did by now. This is such a special place, and to celebrate 165 years is really extraordinary. One of my struggles since I've been living in the Northeast now about most of the last 35 years, and my friend Robert Davis and I often talk about how hard it is to find any place like this. This temple is so unique, and I'm not sure there's really any place like it where I live. Being Jewish is different in the Northeast. When I was growing up here, there were, I think, about 12,000 Jews in a city just under 1 million people. A true story from when I moved to New York in 1992 to work for the Wall Street Journal. I was on my way to a parents of a friend of mine's house in Livingston, New Jersey, not far from where Sophie and Louise and our family live now, and for a Passover Seder, and a colleague at the Journal pulled me aside and said, you might want to leave early. Why? The West Side Highway is going to be a mess because of the Passover traffic. I'm not making it up. There is Passover traffic. The Seder itself, I remember calling my mother and saying, it's really just like our service, except for one thing, which Sophie and Louise, we were at a Seder last weekend, and same thing, they say bitter oib instead of herb. But I get the single most, it really is amazing, and it gets me to what's unique about this place and what people don't always understand about this place, this Jewish community. Still, the single most common response when I say I'm from Memphis and someone knows I'm Jewish is, they're Jews in Memphis? Do you have to go to Nashville to get a minyan? Really. And it's to be able to respond as I do, that not only are there Jews in Memphis, but my temple is 165 years old, is powerful. It's unusual, as this place is. I was thinking about and did a little research around 1854, the year this institution was founded. 1854 means temple is older than plastic, which was invented in 1862. The light bulb, invented in 1879. Coca-Cola, believe it or not, kids, 1886. Time magazine, founded in 1923, which means one more temple is older than time. The chocolate chip cookie, invented in 1930. Nylons, 1935. Ballpoint pens, 1938. Deodorant, 1941. You get the idea. Temple's endurance in an age of fleeting trends and besieged institutions is really remarkable. What is even more remarkable to me, and what makes it so hard to find any place like it, is the strengths of this place, the musical beauty of this service, which is unsurpassed, the connectedness of this community, the historic impact Temple and members of Temple have had on the city of Memphis. There was a article in Tablet, the Jewish online magazine, called House Divided, about the history of the American synagogue, and it said the history of the American synagogue is one of rifts, splits, and factions, which is, of course, the source of the classic Jewish joke, man stranded on desert island for 20 years, finally rescued. His rescuers, he's showing his rescuers around the island, and this is my garden, and this is where I slept at night, and this is the synagogue, and this is the other synagogue, and the rescuer says, you were by yourself. Why two synagogues? This is the synagogue I go to, and this is the synagogue I would never set foot in. What is remarkable about Temple, among other things, is that unlike so many congregations in other cities, it has held together. Rabbi Greenstein told me as we were talking about tonight that Temple is the largest congregation in a small Jewish community in a miracle, which he calls a miracle. What I think is also amazing is that in the entire 165 years, there have only been 8 senior rabbis, and that really tells you something about the draw of this community for all of us, certainly to me. My Torah portion was Toledot, which the English translation of which is Generations, which is the story of the birth and birthright of Esau and Jacob, born to Isaac and Rebekah. And Micah and I talked some about this in the weeks leading up to tonight. It really feels like, my plane didn't land in time for me to ask you what Jewish karma is. There must be a Hebrew term for karma, but to me it feels like karma to be here tonight, because in a way the theme Generations is really the same. The generations of Temple Israel, from the first rabbi Jacob Perry's to Harry Danziger and Micah Greenstein, from my own great-grandparents, the magnolia, these magnolias are all over the country in Felsenthal homes. And if you meet someone and they say they're a Felsenthal, say, do you have a magnolia? It's like a code word. It's a code. It's a code. From my own great-grandparents to my children, Sophie and Louise, and 2-year-old Eric, who's not here tonight, from Isaac, Jacob, and Esau to all of us. And in anticipation of the evening, I really have been thinking a lot about what this legacy from all these generations has meant to me as a person and as a journalist. I'm not exactly sure how I came to be a journalist. I only knew two growing up. One was George Lapidus. I just saw Barbara up here a minute ago, who was a great friend, the sports columnist member here. And the other was a college friend of my father's, who was briefly kidnapped by Nicaraguan rebels covering the Sandinistas. And I have, truth be told, I do know who the Dodgers are. I'm not a sports fan at all. I'm not especially interested in being kidnapped by rebels, so none of that explains it. For me, the journalism bug was more deeply rooted than that. Some 8-year-olds collect baseball cards. I collected Time magazines. When I was 8, I started collecting them, and I'm also a pack rat, so I have, the stack is now in my, if you come to my office in New York, you can see them. They start with the 1974 cover of Ford taking office after Nixon resigned. My grandparents, Eric and Helga Cornell, with whom I spent many Friday nights here, were lifelong readers of Time. I think learned to speak English in part by reading Time. My parents have been lifelong subscribers. In 1978, the year before my bar mitzvah, I clipped and saved an article from Time, which I still have. The subject of the article was a New York psychologist who spent 10 years studying what was clearly one of the world's great issues: why are so many comedians Jewish? And it talked about, true, it talked about Milton Berle, George Burns, Don Rickles, and others, and concluded they were drawn to comedy for two reasons, this 10-year study. First, as a defense mechanism, and second, I don't think this was Time's finest hour, because, quote, these comedians had overprotective, constricting mothers. Hang on. So an article we never wrote, but probably could have, and then I've been thinking a lot about why are so many Jews drawn to journalism? I haven't found any of the current numbers, but just for a start, there was a 1979 survey that found 27% of the staffs of the 3 major TV networks, the 3 major news weeklies, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal were Jewish. Another study that I suspect was wrong was even higher than that. But you know, the list of prominent American journalists who are Jewish is remarkable. Tom Friedman, Jill Abramson, David Brooks, Wolf Blitzer, Ted Koppel, Frank Rich, William Safire, Daniel Shore, Bill Kristol, Barbara Walters, Carl Bernstein. All 3 major broadcast networks were founded by Jews, as was the New York Times, founded by a Jewish man from Tennessee, who I think married the daughter of the founder of Reform Judaism. When the Jewish creators of Superman had to find a job for Clark Kent, where else but a newspaper, the Daily Planet? You know, this is a notion that has long been used to stoke anti-Semitism, the idea of Jewish control of the media, and of course that isn't true, but we clearly play a disproportionate role relative to our numbers. Time was an exception. Time was founded by a man named Henry Luce, the son of Presbyterian missionaries. He grew up in China, where there were few Jews, and then he went to Yale in 1916, where there were even fewer Jews. The first, I looked in the first issue of the magazine from 1923, it mentioned Jews in 3 places, none of them flattering. There's a review of a play about, that the writer describes as about a rich and disagreeable Jew. Exception to some of what I described earlier. 45 years later, Henry Grunwald became the first Jewish editor of Time. There have been several since. Grunwald once asked a colleague if Luce, the founder, the Time founder, was anti-Semitic. No, said the colleague. It's just that he hasn't known many Jews. He has a sense of their being different, but that is not the same as prejudice. He often asks me about this or that issue. What do you think about it as a Jew? And I always have to tell him that I don't think as a Jew. I'm close with Grunwald's daughter, who shared some of this detail with me, and we were talking about it, and I was thinking about it, and I don't know if that response is, he meant it, or just saying I don't think as a Jew seemed like the right thing to say in the 1960s. But I do think as a Jew. I'm sure I do. Not exclusively. I think as a father and a husband and a son and an American and so on. But we're all of us, shaped by where we come from. And clearly there's something about Judaism that has helped steer me and so many other Jews through the decades to journalism. So, like that article about the comedians, I'm going to try and answer why. I think there are 5 reasons, and since my mother is here, I'll say from the outset that none of them have to do with overbearing mothers. You're welcome. First, we are storytellers. When I was in college, the great Israeli writer Amos Oz came to campus and gave a powerful speech that I still remember about the legacy of Jewish writers and Hebrew literature. It all began with words, Oz said that night about the Bible. The creation of the world was a verbal act. This week, of course, we told the Passover story, surely the most often story in our history, the story of freedom itself. I was thinking if time had been around in the Exodus, Pharaoh and Moses would have been on the cover. Time's founder, Luce, who I mentioned a minute ago, was sometimes criticized for focusing on the stories of people rather than on issues, to which he responded, "Time didn't invent personality journalism, the Bible did." Or as we might put it, the Torah did. Second, we are searchers for truth. To me, one of the wonderful and liberating aspects of Judaism is that it gives us permission to doubt, to question. So much of our tradition is rabbis debating, challenging each other. 4 Jews, 10 opinions, as the saying goes. A great Jewish journalist whom I was fortunate to work with both in the Wall Street Journal's Atlanta bureau and in the Washington bureau was Danny Pearl, who, as most of you know, was murdered by terrorists in Pakistan in 2002. His last words, which the captors made him read, were, "I am Jewish," and his parents, Ruth and Judea Pearl, later put together a really beautiful book called I Am Jewish, which is essays, personal reflections by prominent people about what the words I am Jewish means to them. One of the contributors was Daniel Shore, the longtime CBS News and NPR reporter, who, as it happens, was also the father-in-law of, I saw Phyllis Kaplan earlier, of Alex Kaplan, Temple member. And Shore writes, "I was a pretty good Watergate reporter, winning 3 Emmy Awards. Did being Jewish have anything to do with it? We Jews are searchers for truth, sometimes called investigative reporting." Third, community. It's at the core of both Judaism and journalism. Rabbi Greenstein put this beautifully in a note he sent me a few weeks ago as we were back and forth about the topic tonight. He wrote, "In an age of passing trends, rootlessness and impermanence, Toledot, generations, reminds us of the strength derived from being connected to a vibrant congregation and larger family greater than oneself." The words Jewish community are so often used together that it's hard to imagine one without the other. That connectedness is also central to journalism. Journalism, for one thing, wouldn't exist without a community. There would be nothing to write about. But it also has traditionally helped bind communities together by providing a common narrative, a common set of facts. I'm old enough to remember Walter Cronkite signing off with, "That's the way it is." That sounds quaint in our current political environment, which Rabbi Danziger alluded to, but at a time when so many of our problems within communities and globally are interconnected, having that common set of facts, common narrative is as important as ever, if not more important than ever. Fourth, we are pursuers of justice, as the verse from Deuteronomy goes. There's a saying in my business that one duty of journalism is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And if you read Judy Ringel's History of Temple, you will find a long history of our members and rabbis doing just that, from Rabbi Feinschreiber, who led white Memphis ministers to speak out against the Klan and lynchings in 1918, to Rabbi Wax famously shaking that finger at the mayor during the 1968 garbage strike, and Rabbi Greenstein has, of course, continued that tradition of standing up and speaking out for equal rights for all. The pursuit of justice, whether in Judaism or in journalism, requires courage. Rabbi Feinschreiber apparently kept a gun under his pillow. Rabbi Danziger mentioned our choice last year to name the Guardian's very courageous journalists who risk everything in pursuit of a cause greater themselves as Person of the Year in 2018. Two of those journalists are currently imprisoned in Myanmar for telling the story of the cruel treatment of the Rohingya in that country. One in the Philippines has been repeatedly indicted, but undeterred in covering the brutality and duplicity of the Duterte regime in the Philippines, and so on. My friend Jody Cantor, who won a Pulitzer Prize for exposing the Harvey Weinstein scandal in the New York Times, the scandal that launched the Me Too movement, puts it this way: I grew up around people with numbers on their arms. My grandparents are Holocaust survivors. It led me to think about the big questions we often ask in investigative journalism. How could something like this have gone on? What allowed this to happen? And finally, Tikkun Olam, the repair of the world, which in many ways encompasses all of the above. One of the aspects of our tradition that I love is its focus on the present. My grandmother, Pearl, used to be part of a group here called God's Unfinished Business, which went and helped needing people around the community. And you know, this is so much a part of who we are. To me, since what comes next is unknowable, I'm drawn to Judaism's command that we all do our bit in whatever way we can to make this world better. And of course, great journalism seeks to do that as well. Amos Oz, who I quoted earlier, said that in the Hebrew tradition, writers and poets are expected to change reality rather than just describe it. This is such a complicated time, so much anger and discord, misinformation and mistrust. But my feeling is, as a journalist and as a human, if we, all of us, pass on stories, search for truth, strengthen our communities, pursue justice, and do our level best to repair the world, we might just have a shot. After all, with the possible exception of chicken soup, nothing has sustained our people through the centuries more than words passed from parent to child, from rabbi to congregation, from writer to reader, from generation to generation. Toledot.